Johan Liebert pointed to his own forehead more than once in front of the one man in the world who owned a gun and a reason to use it. That's not the gesture of someone who fears dying. It's an invitation extended patiently over years to a specific person for a specific reason. Fans call it his death wish. Watch what he's actually doing every time he offers his own head as a target, and it stops looking like a wish at all. It looks like an experiment he's been running the entire series, and Dr. Tenma is the only subject who was ever going to produce a result worth recording. There's a version of this character the fandom has settled on that makes him easier to hold in your head. A nihilist who's simply stopped valuing his own life, drifting through a corpse count with the detachment of someone who's already decided nothing matters. That version explains the corpses. It doesn't explain the patients. A person who genuinely doesn't care whether he lives or dies has no reason to wait years for one specific man to be the one who ends it. No reason to construct elaborate scenarios instead of simply walking into traffic. The waiting is the detail that breaks the nihilist reading before it even gets started. Johan isn't indifferent to how his life ends. He's extremely specific about it, which means the ending itself is doing work that only makes sense if there's a particular question he needs a particular person to answer with a particular action. The show wants you to believe this is a manhunt, a good doctor chasing down the monster he accidentally created, driven by guilt, trying to undo one terrible mistake before more people die. That reading isn't wrong exactly, it's just incomplete in the one way that matters most, because it assumes Tenma is the one steering. He isn't. Almost every major turn in that pursuit happens because Johan arranged for it to happen, engineered a specific set of conditions, and waited to see what Tenma would do once no easy answer was left on the table. This was never a chase. It was a trial, with Johan as the prosecutor, and the only verdict he actually cared about was whether the man who once saved his life could be made to end someone else's. Go back to where it starts, because nothing that follows makes sense without the hospital. Tenma is given an impossible choice, dressed up as a simple one. Operate on the boy first, or operate on the mare first, when only one of them can survive the wait. He chooses the boy, not because the boy is more important, because his entire ethic, the one thing he's built his whole identity as a doctor around, is a human life is a human life, full stop, with no asterisk for status or usefulness or who's more convenient to save. That's not a soft sentiment he's reciting for the cameras. It's closer to a law he's decided to follow absolutely. The kind of law that only means anything if it holds even when honoring it costs him something real. Notice what he isn't doing in that scene, because the absence matters as much as the choice itself. He isn't weighing the mare's political usefulness against the boy's. He isn't running a calculation about which outcome serves more people, which death would ripple out further, which life carries more downstream value to the hospital or the city or anyone watching. He's simply refusing to run that calculation at all, on principle, treating the question of relative worth as one that shouldn't even be asked. That refusal is the entire architecture of who he is, established before Johan has said a single word to him, and it's the exact architecture Johan is going to spend the rest of the story testing for load-bearing weakness. And it does cost him something real. His career gets quietly dismantled by the hospital politics he's just defied, piece by piece in the following weeks, exactly as anyone could have predicted. Then the boy he saved starts killing the people responsible for that punishment. One by one, the doctors who engineered Tenma's fall die in ways that look, on the surface, like justice arriving from nowhere. It isn't from nowhere. It's a thank you note written in blood, delivered by a child who has just learned, with total clarity, exactly what kind of moral commitment saved his life, and exactly how much that commitment cost the man who held it. Tenma didn't ask for the gift. He gets it anyway. And it arrives soaked in exactly the currency his principle was supposed to reject, the idea that some lives are worth more than others, repaid now in the specific deaths of people who happen to be inconvenient. Sit with the cruelty of the specific design here, because it's more precise than simple revenge would need to be. A child grateful for being saved might lash out at his enemies in a fit of rage that fades. What Johan does instead reads as calculated, patient, methodical, the exact same qualities that will define every later confrontation with Tenma. He isn't discharging anger. He's making a point, early, before either of them can fully articulate what the point is, that the principle Tenma just paid for so dearly can be twisted into its exact opposite by someone who understands it well enough to weaponize it. Equal worth becomes an excuse for unequal punishment. The law meant to protect everyone becomes the pretext for protecting no one who crossed its holder. That's the shape of the entire relationship, established before either of them has said more than a few words to each other. Johan isn't grateful in any ordinary sense. He's testing, from the very first transaction, what Tenma's principle is actually made of, whether it can survive contact with a world that keeps punishing him for holding it, or whether, given enough pressure, it starts to look less like a law and more like a preference he'll eventually trade away. Years pass, and the pattern doesn't change, it just gets more direct. Johan starts pointing to his own head. Quietly at first, almost as a private joke only he seems to understand. Later, in front of witnesses, with less and less ambiguity about what he's offering. It happens most explicitly in Ruhenheim at the end, with a child held at gunpoint and Johan's own head presented as the alternative target, as if the whole scene had been staged specifically to force one clean decision out of a man who spent his entire adult life refusing to make decisions like that. But by the time Ruhenheim happens, the gesture has already been repeated enough times in enough contexts that it reads less like a spontaneous dare and more like a standing offer Johan's kept open the entire time he's been running from Tenma rather than toward him. Think about what that gesture actually requires from the person making it. Fear of death doesn't produce that posture. A person genuinely afraid to die protects the vulnerable point, doesn't advertise it, doesn't stand still and invite the shot. Johan does the opposite, repeatedly, calmly, in exactly the moments where Tenma is closest to breaking. That's not suicidal ideation dressed up as villainy, it's leverage. He's using his own death as the one object valuable enough to make Tenma reconsider the law he's held onto through years of losing everything for it. And every time he offers it, he's asking the same question in a slightly louder voice. Is this principle actually unconditional, or does it just have a price nobody's found yet? There's a specific cruelty to the timing of when he chooses to make the offer, too, one worth noticing because it never happens randomly. Johan doesn't point to his own forehead in a moment of safety when the stakes are low and the gesture would cost Tenma nothing to refuse. He does it in the exact instant Tenma has the most reason imaginable to want him dead, after another body, after another piece of evidence confirming the scale of what he's caused, after Tenma's own restraint has already been stretched as thin as the story is willing to stretch it before the next confrontation. The offer only ever arrives at maximum pressure, which is exactly what you'd expect from a test designed to find the actual breaking point, rather than a comfortable hypothetical one. If Tenma were his only experiment, that alone would be a strong case. He isn't. Look at what Johan does with Richard Brown, because it's the cleanest demonstration of the method running on someone who was never chasing him and never needed to be. Richard is a recovering alcoholic, a detective trying to hold together a sobriety he's fought hard for, carrying his own private weight of guilt from a past he doesn't fully discuss. Johan doesn't kill him, he doesn't threaten him, he sits with him, hands him a bottle, and talks, patiently, attentively, in the exact register of someone offering comfort until Richard walks to a roof and steps off it entirely on his own. That scene is worth sitting with longer than the show gives you time to, because it's the clearest proof available of what Johan's actual weapon is. He isn't forcing anyone's hand directly, he's identifying whatever a person already carries, guilt, shame, a wound they've been quietly managing for years, and applying just enough pressure in just the right place that the person does the rest of the work themselves. Richard doesn't get pushed, he gets understood in a way that turns out to be more dangerous than any threat, because being understood by Johan means having the exact weak point in your own self-control identified and gently, conversationally leaned on until it gives. Watch what Johan withholds in that scene as carefully as what he provides. He doesn't lie to Richard about what the bottle represents. He doesn't manufacture a false comfort or promise things will be fine. He simply removes every obstacle standing between Richard and the choice Richard has already on some level been considering. The whiskey placed within reach, the conversation steered toward exactly the memories that hurt most, the silence left open at precisely the moment silence does the most damage. Nothing here required force, it required knowing with total accuracy which door in a person was already unlatched. That's the method Tenma's been fighting the entire series, without necessarily recognizing it as a method. Johan doesn't need to make anyone do anything. He needs to find the one door already slightly open and stand in the frame until the person walks through it themselves, convinced the choice was entirely their own. Line the two scenes up next to each other, the hospital and the rooftop, and the same architecture appears in both, just aimed at different vulnerabilities. With the doctors, the vulnerability was Tenma's principle itself, weaponized against the people who'd punished him for holding it. With Richard, the vulnerability was a private guilt that had nothing to do with Tenma at all. What's constant across both isn't the target. It's the refusal to force anything directly, the patience to identify exactly what's already fragile in a person, and the willingness to wait as long as it takes for that fragility to do the actual work. Richard proves the technique doesn't require years of built-up history, the way the Tenma relationship has. It just requires accurate observation and enough time in the room, which is exactly what makes Ruhenheim, when it finally arrives, feel less like an isolated confrontation and more like the same operation Johan's been running successfully his entire life, now finally pointed at its intended and most difficult target. Which is what makes the counter-argument worth taking seriously, because there's a version of this story that reads completely differently, and it's not a weak version. Across the entire manhunt, Tenma keeps saving people who have nothing to do with Johan at all. He treats Nina, going by Anna for most of the story, with the same total commitment he showed the boy in the hospital, protecting her, caring for her, refusing to let her become collateral in anyone else's plan. He operates on wounded criminals without hesitation, people society would say don't deserve his skill, and he does it anyway, every time, without visible internal debate. If his humanism were actually corroding under the pressure of the hunt, you'd expect to see it slipping in these smaller moments too, some hardness creeping into how he treats the people who aren't Johan, some erosion visible in the ordinary, unglamorous acts of care that don't make it into the show's biggest scenes. That erosion never really shows up. Every stranger who crosses Tenma's path outside the central conflict gets exactly the same doctor he was at the beginning of the story, patient and total in his commitment, no different than the man who chose the boy over the mare. Push the counter-argument as far as it deserves to go before answering it, because there's more supporting it than just consistency across strangers. Tenma has, by any reasonable measure, more reason than almost anyone alive to have hardened by this point in the story. He's watched people he cared about die because of the man he saved. He's been hunted, framed, forced into hiding, stripped of the career and the reputation his principal originally cost him. A weaker version of this character would have snapped years earlier, somewhere in the middle of that accumulating cost, long before Ruhenheim ever became necessary. He doesn't. Whatever's keeping him upright through all of that looks from any angle except the one directly facing Johan, like a man whose ethic has survived everything thrown at it. That's a real complication, and it deserves to stand for a moment before it gets resolved, because it's not obviously wrong. A person whose core ethic was actually failing should show cracks everywhere, not just in one relationship. Tenma doesn't, which means either the thesis is wrong and Johan's pressure never actually threatened anything real, or there's something specific about the confrontation with Johan himself that the rest of the story was never designed to test.
It's the second one, and the distinction is exactly where the philosophy underneath this whole conflict actually does its work instead of just sitting there as commentary. Tenma's principle that a human life is a human life, that worth can't be measured out in degrees depending on who's asking, functions the way an absolute law is supposed to function. It isn't supposed to bend based on circumstance, it's supposed to hold precisely because it doesn't bend, the same way a rule that only applies when it's convenient was never really a rule to begin with, just a preference wearing a rule's clothing. There's a specific kind of moral law that only counts as a law if it survives its hardest case, and softer cases don't actually verify it. A rule against lying doesn't get tested by whether you tell the truth to people you like, it gets tested by whether you tell the truth when lying would clearly help someone you love. Tenma's version works the same way, saving strangers, treating wounded criminals, protecting Nina. None of that actually tests whether the law is absolute, it only tests whether Tenma is a good, consistent person under normal conditions, and he clearly is. Every one of those cases is, in a sense, cheap. They cost him effort, sometimes risk, but never the one thing an absolute principle actually has to survive to earn the name, a circumstance where following it feels, in the moment, like a betrayal of everything else he cares about. The real test was always going to require a case specifically designed to make the law's cost unbearable, a case where holding the principle meant actively protecting the one person responsible for the worst suffering Tenma has personally witnessed over and over for years. That's also what separates a genuine categorical commitment from the kind of moral flexibility most people actually live by without ever noticing the difference. Most people's ethics are conditional, quietly, without ever being tested harshly enough to reveal it, generous until generosity gets expensive, honest until honesty costs something real.
Tenma built his entire identity on insisting his wasn't conditional in that way. Johan is the only entity in the story with both the intelligence to understand exactly what that claim requires and the patience to construct a scenario extreme enough to actually check it. That's the case Johan builds, not through argument, through relentless, patient construction, engineering scenario after scenario where the abstract cost of Tenma's principles stops being abstract and starts having a face, a name, a body count Tenma can recite from memory. By the time Ruhenheim happens, the categorical version of Tenma's belief has been under direct, sustained assault in exactly one place, from exactly one source, for exactly as long as Johan has been alive to apply the pressure. Everywhere else, the law was never actually being tested. There, it was being tested constantly, deliberately, by someone who understood precisely what would make an unconditional principle feel, for the first time, genuinely conditional. Every earlier confrontation between them had an exit built into it, whether either man used it or not. Somewhere in the scene there was still a version of events where Tenma could walk away without firing and tell himself the choice hadn't really been tested. A witness who might intervene, a piece of uncertainty about what Johan would actually do, some detail letting the encounter end without forcing the question all the way to its conclusion. Ruhenheim removes that exit deliberately. There's no more room for Tenma to tell himself the confrontation hasn't fully arrived yet. Ruhenheim is where the trial reaches its verdict, and the verdict isn't the clean one the audience wants. Johan holds a child at gunpoint, points to his own forehead again, one more time, the same gesture repeated across years, finally cashed in at the moment it was always built for. And Tenma raises his weapon, not with hesitation dressed up as resolve, not as a bluff meant to end the standoff peacefully, but with genuine, visible, lethal intent. The show doesn't soften this. For that stretch of the confrontation, the man who once refused to let a hospital's politics decide whose life mattered more is standing there prepared to end one specific human life because the cost of not ending it has finally, after years of engineering, become unbearable enough to override the law he built his entire identity on. Everything about the staging in that moment is built to strip away every excuse Tenma might otherwise have reached for. There's no ambiguity about Johan's guilt left to hide behind, no lingering possibility he's misunderstood the situation, no way to tell himself this might be a mistake he'd regret. Years of evidence have already closed every one of those doors. What's left is only the law itself, tested at its most expensive possible moment, with a child's life visibly weighing on the other side of the scale, and no comfortable middle option available. Johan built exactly this, a scenario with every softening variable removed, so that whatever Tenma does next can only be read as what the law actually amounts to when it costs everything to keep. That's the moment the counter-argument actually collapses, not because Tenma stopped caring about strangers, but because the test was never about strangers. It was about whether the one absolute rule could survive contact with the one person built deliberately, patiently, across the whole story to make breaking it feel not just permissible, but necessary. For a moment in Ruhenheim, it doesn't survive. Tenma's finger is on the trigger with the specific, singular intention of using it. What happens next is where the story quietly declines to let its hero win the trial on his own merits, and it's worth being honest about exactly how thin that margin is, even if the show never states the interpretation outright. Wim Naup's father is the one who fires, not Tenma.
The shot that finally ends Johan's threat comes from someone else entirely, a grieving man with his own reasons, arriving at exactly the second where Tenma's resolve had already tipped past the point of return. Read generously, that timing is coincidence, one more tragic figure in a story full of them, acting on grief that has nothing to do with Tenma's internal struggle at all. Read more carefully, against everything that's led up to that instant, it looks like something closer to the story quietly declining to let Tenma resolve his own trial. That's not Tenma successfully holding the line. That's the line already broken, and a stranger's bullet arriving before anyone gets to find out what Tenma would actually have done a half-second later. Consider what the scene would have needed to look like for it to genuinely prove Tenma's resolve intact, because the version that actually happens isn't that scene. It would have needed Tenma lowering the weapon himself, choosing not to fire, demonstrating in his own body and his own decision that the law held even here, even now, even against the one person built specifically to break it. That's not what's on screen. What's on screen is the weapon still raised, the intent still live, and an outcome decided by someone else's hand before Tenma's own choice ever had to complete itself. The story preserves his moral purity, but it does it through timing, not through triumph, through an intervention neither man asked for, rather than through Tenma proving, on his own, that a categorical version of his belief could survive its designer's best attempt to break it. That's a harder ending than the manhunt narrative wants you to remember, and it's harder specifically because of what it says about the whole years-long contest. Johan never needed Tenma to actually pull the trigger to win his experiment. He needed to prove the law could be pushed to the edge of collapse by someone who understood exactly how to apply pressure to it. And by Ruhenheim, that proof already existed, independent of who physically fired the shot. The trial was never really about the bullet. It was about whether an absolute principle, tested by an entity built specifically to disprove it, would still be standing, intact and unconditional at the end. For one visible moment in Ruhenheim, it wasn't standing at all. It was one stranger's grief away from becoming exactly the kind of conditional, circumstance-dependent judgment Tenma had spent his whole life insisting it could never become. Which reframes the entire manhunt once you can see what it was actually testing, instead of what it looked like it was testing. This was never a story about a good man chasing down evil to protect the innocent, even though every individual scene plays that way in isolation. It was a slow, patient trial conducted by the one person with both the intelligence and the motive to design a test precise enough to threaten an unconditional moral law. Repaying a debt in blood at a hospital, offering his own death as bait for years, demonstrating the exact mechanism of the manipulation on someone else first, so the method would be unmistakable once it finally turned on its intended target. It also means the forehead was never really an invitation to end things quickly. It was a question asked patiently across years by the one person capable of asking it properly, whether a rule built to apply to everyone, without exception, could actually survive meeting the one exception it was never allowed to make. Tenma spent the whole series believing he was the one applying pressure, closing in, forcing a confrontation. He was the subject the entire time, and the results of that experiment came back inconclusive only because someone else's finger got there first.